diorama, welcome aboard.
Hi gentle people, glad to find you back today. In this video, I will show you how to sculpt animals at scale 1/35 for your dioramas. Aside from the fact that it's quite cheap to do that, it's much cheaper than to buy 3D prints, for example. It's also quite challenging and funny, and it's less complicated than I initially thought. You can also consider the fact that if you had to draw those animals to realize 3D prints yourself, it might be much more time consuming. This polar bear, for example, was sculpted in only 3 days. Okay, let's speak first about the equipment you need to be able to sculpt these animals. First of all, I advise you to work with gloves. It could be latex or nitrile gloves. Personally, I do prefer the nitrile ones, which are a bit more resistant. You need alcohol, isopropylic and flat brushes regularly to clean your project and to remove the potential fingerprints. You need amplification lenses. These are, for example, mine with an amplification of 2.5. That's quite useful when you need to work small items like these or eyeballs. You need for sure precision tweezers and a hobby knife, small scissors, and it could be nice to have scissors able to cut photo etched, for example. Wire cutter and pliers are required to build a skeleton that will be realized with steel wires. Speaking about steel wires, I use 3 different sizes, the biggest one being 1.3 mm, the intermediate size is 0.8 mm, and the smallest one is 0.55 mm diameter. Now, to sculpt the clay, what do we need? Well, there are a lot of tools available on the market, but after a little bit of experience, you will see that you will work most of the time with the same ones. The cheapest ones being the cuticle sticks and the toothpicks. You will also find on the market a lot of silicone brushes, black ones, grey ones. The black ones are stiffer. Now you have a lot of different shapes, but honestly, I'm always working with the same ones, being this conic black brush, this big rounded grey brush, which is interesting at the very beginning to give shape to your clay, and that pointed V-shaped black brush, also very interesting to draw lines and separate items, for example. I almost never use all the other brushes, so with those 3 brushes you can almost face all situations. I also bought initially these metal tools, but I've noticed that they are almost useless. I think those tools are planned initially to be used to dig, to excavate and remove material in your sculpture. It's probably really useful for big-sized objects, but given the size of our little animals at scale 1/35, it's really difficult to use these tools. A very important item is the needle. So here I used an unused drill on which I fitted a compass point. It's very useful to sculpt the fur of the animal, for example. You can see here that I also have quite a lot of metal dentist curettes. If you have a needle, honestly, these tools are useless. Nevertheless, those 2 items here are also very interesting. That one with the flat surface is nice to merge, to blend the different pieces of clay together. And those rounded objects are also very nice for the same purpose, but also to dig the eyeball orbits, for example. All the rest of those metallic curettes you have seen here are not essential, so do not waste your money to buy that. You can easily substitute those items with toothpicks or with a simple needle. Okay, now probably the most essential part of all, what product, what clay do I use to create sculptures? Well, without any doubt for me, the easiest product is polymer clay, and I use Super Sculpey Firm. Without waiting, let's go to work and let's start with the creation of fishes, in this case North Atlantic cods. As you can see, for all my animals projects, I work with printed pictures of that animal at the right scale, so that I already know what size it has at that scale. This also proves to be very helpful to verify regularly the different shapes and volumes. To reinforce my sculptures, I use metallic wire to create the skeleton. The diameter of the metal wire is selected according to the animal size. So here, for this fish, I used a 0.8 mm wire. This wire will be inserted through the clay. The biggest advantage of polymer clay versus, for example, milliput or green stuff is that there is no drying period. I mean, you can work the clay as long as you want. So long this clay is not baked in the oven, it remains flexible and workable, so you have no time pressure, and so long you are not happy with the final result, you can correct and modify your sculpture, which turns the whole business really easier. The shape of a fish is not that difficult to sculpt. I mean, it's just like a small worm, so basically you just turn the clay into your fingers until you reach the desired shape. The only details that you have to sculpt are the eyes, the mouth and the gills. For the eyes, I used an old paintbrush on which I removed the bristles. For the mouth, of course, using a hobby knife is perfect. You can then improve a little bit the areas around the eyes and the mouth with the conic silicone brush, just to fine-tune a little bit the details and the shape. Most of the time, you can use your own fingers to correct a little bit the global shape. There isn't much left to do. We still have to sculpt the gills with the hobby knife. An important point with real animals is that we have to respect the proportion and the characteristics inherent to each species. So here I'm trying to reproduce North Atlantic cods. At that scale, no need to try to reproduce the fish scales, it's much too small. The last details that we need to add are the fins. An important aspect you must know with polymer clay is that for very thin pieces, polymer clay, once baked, becomes very fragile. This is also a material which is complicated to manipulate once very thin. It becomes very flexible and a simple touch can modify its shape. So personally for the fins, I have decided to use brass sheet. That sheet here has a thickness of 0.08 mm. I divided my work in two steps. The first step being to create the tail fin. This tail fin will be inserted right inside the polymer clay before baking it. And all the other fins will be glued later in position with cyanoacrylate glue after the polymer clay has been baked, so when it's completely rock hard. You see here that I insert the tail fin within the polymer clay while this clay is still flexible, soft. And then immediately afterwards I will fine-tune the shape of the body around this tail fin. Once ready, I will bake my polymer clay for 20 minutes in the oven at 110 degrees Celsius. As explained, all the other fins have been glued with cyanoacrylate on the polymer clay after this clay has been baked, so of course when it's hard. Now we can paint the fishes. Nothing difficult with that. I will apply a first layer of gloss black Tamiya on the fish. It will be a kind of primer, on top of which I will apply an aluminium alclad color. Oh, why aluminium? Just because, you know, those fishes in the water have this kind of silver aluminium reflection. So I think it's a good base to start working. Now, I won't leave, of course, the fish in aluminium. On top of this aluminium base coat, I will apply for the belly a layer of insignia white. The lateral sides and the top side of the body will be painted Tamiya khaki. My friend Travis from Gets Miniatures sent me some time ago now this new product, a kind of blue sponge on a white stick, and since then it's the first time that I have the opportunity to make a trial with it. The idea here will be to use this sponge with a little bit of acrylic color burnt umber to realize some tiny spots on the flanks and on top of this fish. I was really happy with the result. Those little blue sponges are a little bit more rigid than the classical pieces of sponge that I use generally, and I managed to create smaller spots, especially with that sharpened sponge. I received two different sponges, one very sharp and the other one with different shapes. Another advantage compared to the classical work with small pieces of sponge cut and maintained in position with tweezers is that in this case the sponge is glued on the stick, which makes it a little bit easier to work with. It was then necessary to paint the fins of the cuts, and to reproduce the impression of depth I applied some stripes of burnt umber and warm grey. I finally add the longitudinal line with that same color on the flanks of my cuts. The final touch was to paint the eyes. I did it in two steps, a first layer of copper metallic color, on top of which I applied a little black dot. To conclude this chapter on those three cuts, I applied 3 layers of acrylic gloss varnish just to protect our paint, as those fishes will be immersed in the epoxy resin later. Well, let's jump to the second animal. I will show you here how I did my two seals. Given the size of the seals is a bit bigger than the fishes, it was much easier to create a support to facilitate the handling of my sculpture while working. I've decided to pass the steel wire used to create the skeleton through a little wooden stick. This small skeleton you see here will be sent to the oven before applying the final layer of polymer clay. Okay, now our skeleton is rock hard. It has been baked and we can wrap it with polymer clay and start to sculpt our seal. A bit too fat, but don't worry with that. We will continue and proceed with the head. Let's add a little polymer clay ball on top of our body and blend it with the rest of the sculpture. Using reference picture, we will try to locate the eye position, the nose position, and shape how thick the nose is. It is not an easy part, but we have plenty of time. I had to redo it twice before reaching an acceptable result. The first attempt was really dramatic. I had to start all over again, so that's not something that comes right after the first attempt. You need to make trials, you need to make errors. It's part of the game, until you reach something which is quite acceptable. The good point is that there is no time pressure, and that's why I like so much to work with polymer clay. This clay doesn't dry once in contact with the air, so you can try and try and try again. You can take your time, and only after several attempts you will reach a correct result. Using high quality reference pictures, I sculpt the nose with a hobby knife. I advise you to work first with the upper jaw, and then only once you are happy with the result, you start with the lower jaw. I was really impressed to see how big the teeth of these giant slugs are. Seals have big teeth, but they also have claws at the end of their fins. I've decided to reproduce the teeth and the claws using polymer clay. As you can see, you just create tiny sausages and cut the edges to reproduce the teeth and the claws. We will then bake these items in the oven, maximum 10 minutes at 110 degrees, just to make them hard. I really advise you to do quite a lot of them to have spare parts, as during handling you will lose quite a lot of them, either because they fall on the ground or just because they break in your tweezers. It's super fragile. Putting these teeth in position was challenging. You will need quite a bit of patience and try to work a very delicate manner. This is the situation prior to install the eyeballs. We still need to correct a little bit the shapes and the teeth position, and then we can start with the eyeballs. To realize the eyeballs, I just use polymer clay. I found it easier to put the eyeballs in position after the work on the jaws was completed. If you put the eyeballs first and then you work on the jaws, you take the risk to modify the eyeballs position just by applying pressure on the different parts of the tiny head. And that's quite difficult afterwards to correct. As you can see here, the little eyeballs have been solidified with a blowtorch to spare time. But you can also do it using the oven. Watch out with the blowtorch, you must be fast in order not to burn the clay. It's important to solidify the eyeballs prior to insert them in the orbits so that afterwards we can apply pressure around them without damaging their shape. The rest of the work is just to use the different tools you have at your disposal to correct the global shape around the eyes. Now that the head is completed, we can fine-tune a little bit the body appearance. Our seal was a little bit too fat, so let's take care of this. We can create some folds around the neck, and don't forget the ears of our seals located well behind the eyes. At this stage our seal is almost completed, the only thing missing are the fins, the two pectoral fins and the tail fin. It's time to clean our seal with alcohol isopropylic just to make the skin a little bit smoother, remove the potential fingerprints, polymer clay dust on the surface, and then we will bake our seal for 30-35 minutes at 110 degrees Celsius in the oven to make it hard. It's time now to care for the fins. It's important to verify the different proportions using reference pictures. That way, we are sure that our seal won't look weird after the fins are placed on the body. I have decided to use milliput to realize these fins as polymer clay is rather inadapted. It's too fragile and too flexible. I will use a piece of steel wire to better anchor these fins on the body. So Magic Sculpt, for those who do not know what it is a two-component resin. So you must mix both components correctly together with equal parts, and after that you get a clay that will start to harden within a given time lapse. Let's say you have around an hour to get the job done. The junction between polymer clay, which is already hard, and this Magic Sculpt do not present any issue. There are no specific problems. You do not need to glue anything. Now, watch out that milliput, as I said, has a curing time. You have a little bit more pressure because within that given period of time, you need to be able to finish your piece. When it comes to very thin, very small pieces, milliput is more resistant once hard. And it's also a little bit less flexible than polymer clay while working, which turns the building process easier. Once you are happy with the final result, I advise you to use alcohol isopropylic with a paintbrush, again to clean your sculpture, but as well to better integrate both materials together. Alcohol isopropylic will make the blending between both materials really nice without the need to sand milliput once dry. For the tail fin, I had to work in two steps. The first step was to create the small tail of the seal, as seals have a tiny tail in between their two tail fins. I create first this tail, I let it dry completely to get it hard, and then only, second step, I applied my two little tail fins on both sides of it. After the drying period, I noticed that the tail of my seal was a little bit too long, so I used my mini drill to sand it and to reduce its size. That's also a good point with milliput. Once dry, you can sand it. You can use a mini drill if you want to correct the shape. or just sandpapers to correct small imperfections. As you can see, the fact that the tail of the seal has already hardened makes it much easier to apply both fins on each side and to blend the different milliput elements together without taking the risk to modify the shape of the tail or to see it completely disappear. Again here, we use alcohol isopropylic to clean the piece we have just created and to blend correctly both materials together. The last step was to put the claws into position at the end of the fins. As I explained, you can drill and sand milliput once hard. It's much more solid than the polymer clay, so the risk to break pieces is reduced. The tiny claws have been glued in position with cyanoacrylate glue prior painting. To ease the gluing process and to accelerate this process, I also made use of cyanoactivator. Okay, the very last step of our sculpture is to remove the wooden support using the mini drill and to fill in the hole of that support with a little bit of milliput. I apologize, but I forgot to turn on the camera to record the images to show you how I realized the whiskers of my seal. But luckily, I recorded everything with my cell phone. So here is the answer. These whiskers are just cactus spines. These are the sharpest and the smallest items I managed to find to replicate these whiskers correctly. I just glue them in position with cyanoacrylate glue. Well, I've decided not to develop the whole painting procedure I use for those two seals. If you have any question related to that matter, you can send me a direct message. Let's develop now a bit more in detail the last challenging project with the creation of our polar bear. Given the more substantial size of the sculpture, it was possible to integrate a full metallic skeleton to help maintaining the proportion. Here again, it's very important to start with at-scale pictures of the skeleton of this animal. The skeleton will be realized with steel wire using the biggest diameter, so the 1.3 mm, and we will also use the 0.55 mm wire around it to offer a better grip to our polymer clay, as you will see later. This important step is probably the easiest one. Using pliers and steel wire, you will just replicate the shape of the different bones of your subject. You can find the dimension of the polar bear on the internet. We need the complete body length and its height at the shoulders, so that we can print pictures with Photoshop directly with the right dimension. There are different schools to realize this steel skeleton. Personally, I've opted for a welding procedure because I found it easier. Now you can realize the whole skeleton with only one wire, making multiple trips back and forth. But I found this procedure less adapted for that scale. Welding that kind of structure with tin is really easy. Just apply a little bit of grease on the different pieces and then apply a little bit of tin at the wire's junctions. The welding is immediate, robust and easy to realize. No need to be an expert at welding nor to buy expensive equipment. This basic equipment is much than sufficient for that kind of work, especially because after that we will apply polymer clay on top. As you see, a single wire skeleton is easy to bend. It's easy to give the body the desired attitude. As I explained initially, we will wrap this skeleton with a thinner wire, the 0.55 mm, just to give more adherence, more grip to our polymer clay around those thicker wires. This will actually avoid our polymer clay slipping around the main wire. As I said, creating this steel skeleton is really easy, really fast, and it will be a game changer later to create the different volumes with the polymer clay. Here, I create a support for my polar bear, adding a vertical wire that extends beyond the legs. This is also welded directly on the previous structure. That will be much easier later to work on our sculpture with polymer clay, but as well to paint it. The next phase, also related to the skeleton creation, is to wrap this metallic structure with polymer clay. Here, I use remainders of Fimosoft polymer clay. I only use that clay for skeletons as it is much too soft for the final work. The idea here of this wrapping is not already to create the full volumes of our polar bear, but just to create a first volume on top of which we will apply the super sculpty firm. As soon as we are happy with this first volume, we will send this skeleton to the oven, where we will bake it at 110 degrees Celsius during 30 minutes. After that, we will have a hard structure on which it will be easier to apply our final polymer clay, to apply pressure left and right without all the time creating deformations. Watch out, this skeleton must remain thin in order to be able to apply a layer of polymer clay that is sufficient to be sculpted. Here, for example, I had to use my mini drill to remove a little bit of material after the baking process to leave enough space for my polymer clay. We are now ready to apply our final super sculpty firm. I don't know if it's the best procedure, but personally I've decided to work from bottom to top. My decision was to create the full body from feet to the neck and to finish the work with the head construction. As you can see, I progressively add polymer clay balls on top of each other to create the volume step by step. It's always possible to remove or add material, and if your clay has been prepared correctly, it's soft enough to transfer material from one side to another just by applying pressure on it with your fingers. You can also remove material with your hobby knife whenever needed. The metallic tools are used to blend all the different pieces of polymer clay together. There is no time pressure with polymer clay, so you have plenty of time to work this clay. You can come back the next day to continue if you want, if you need a break. What's obviously quite important is that you need to have reference pictures always present next to you so that you can constantly compare what you are doing with actual reference pictures. The eyeballs, the teeth and the claws have been realized using the exact same procedure as I use for the seals. So it's just polymer clay little balls that are then baked in the oven. Of course, given the quantity of material is really small, you have to reduce the baking time. I left my clay during only 10 minutes in the oven at 110 degrees Celsius. I really advise you to do much more than needed, so at least twice the number of teeth and claws. As you can see, I also realized multiple eyeballs with different sizes, so that I have more possible choices when I will insert them in the eyeball orbits. You can see here how I prepare the feet to insert the claws, and as I explained, you have to prepare a lot of them to have some spare pieces as they are really fragile. You will most probably break some claws and teeth just by applying pressure on your tweezers, and you might also lose some of them falling on the ground. You know what I mean. Their fitting in the fresh polymer clay is quite unstable, so as you can see, holes are a little bit bigger than the claws and teeth initially, and despite applying pressure on them with the silicone brush later to lock them in position, their position will remain unstable. That's why after the final baking I add a drop of cyanoacrylate glue on all claws and teeth, just to be sure that those items won't fall from the sculpture in the future. I then continue to sculpt the different volumes and items from bottom to top. We are not yet taking into consideration the fur, so here we just create the right volumes and the different items. It will be, however, necessary to already print the different folds at the right location using reference pictures. For that job, I use the conic or the V-shaped silicone brushes most of the time. These are the most appropriate tools. It's quite precise and small enough to work at that scale. We will repeat the close procedure for the front paws, and given its standing position, it will be necessary as well to sculpt the paw pads. Nothing difficult here. Our polar bear is almost done. We have now to complete the work with the creation of the head, and that was the most frightening section for me. It took me one full day to realize the main body, and I've decided to start the head the next day so that I could be more focused and my eyes relaxed a little bit more. Here as well there are multiple schools. The most experienced sculptors are used to construct the volumes, adding clay progressively. For me, I had the feeling that it was easier to work with a bigger volume and then to remove progressively the excess of clay until I reached the right volume. So you are constantly working a little bit with the tools and a little bit with your fingers. Given the head is a little bit more massive as the one of the seal, I've decided to insert the eyeballs in the orbits immediately. I then add a little bit of polymer clay around to create the eyebrows and locked the eyeballs in position. I then locate precisely the position of the ears well aft of the head. Again, here we do not work the fur yet. It's just creating the different volumes. So the very last step prior to sculpt the fur was to realize the jaws and the bear's nose. It was quite a challenging task given I really wanted to get its mouth opened. Just like for the seals, I advise you to start first with the upper jaw. Watch out not to deform completely the head and the position of the eyeballs, so watch out when you apply pressure on the different part of your bear. You must verify constantly that the rest of the animal didn't suffer any deformation. Well, prior to start with the final step of the sculpting procedure, which is sculpting the fur, I completely clean my bear with alcohol isopropylic to remove clay dust, fingerprints, and to smooth the surface. A very important aspect of the fur is to respect the global direction of the fur, but as well its depth. The polar bear's fur can present two very different aspects. The first one is the fur which is completely dry, so the bear stayed a long time outside of the water and has a plush appearance. The second aspect is the polar bear's fur that is completely wet. When wet, its fur shows more depth with clumps of hair divided by deeper crevices. But anyway, a common point is that the upper head is covered with much shorter fur, so there is much less depth on this area. To work the main thicker fur, I've decided to work with a needle, a very important tool, very interesting one as you can create lines all around the body. As I already said, it's important to follow the fur's direction according to the area we are working on. I highly advise you to use reference pictures to do that job. When you want to create more depth in the fur, just apply more pressure on the needle to go deeper in the clay. It's also necessary from time to time to use alcohol isopropylic to remove the polymer clay dust at the surface. Watch out anyway not to apply too much alcohol and not too much pressure on your paintbrush, just to avoid to destroy the work you have done so far. Alcohol isopropylic can really dissolve polymer clay, so watch out with that. This fur sculpting process is rather time consuming, so it's worth doing some poses from time to time just to relax your eyes and to stay well focused when working. Well, not so bad. Our polar bear is now ready to go in the oven for the final baking process, and as you can see, the initial volumes did not change and the different folds are still visible. Let's finish quickly this video by speaking a little bit about the painting process for this polar bear. I started to give a layer of black primer, Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500, on which I applied my base coat, 9 parts of Insignia white for 1 part of pale sand. The mixture was diluted at 50%. I then realized some brownish areas with this Migamo shader earth. The use of these shaders is easy as you can apply the product pure directly from the bottle, and if you apply too much of that product, you can even remove the excess with a paintbrush dipped in water. The location of these brown spots has to be carefully checked with reference pictures. I then further continue with the shader Dirt from the same brand. Working with reference picture greatly helps to identify all these areas where the fur is not white. The transition between these colors has to be soft. That's why the use of shader facilitates the process. Prior to the finishing touch with the oil paints, there are some works that needs to be done with a paintbrush and acrylic colors, like the claws, the teeth, the eyeballs and the paw pads, for example. My paintbrush reference is a Marta Kolinsky No. 1. That type of paintbrush really enhances the precision of the work and the beauty of the paint. To give a wilder aspect and more aggressive aspect to my polar bear, I add a little bit of drool going out of its mouth. For this, I use UV resin for this task. I also put UV resin in the mouth, and I use that UV resin to glue my drool in position. To complete the painting job on that polar bear, I finalized the work with different oil paint references. I used the oil paints to reinforce the contrast and the depth in some areas, to reinforce the shadow effects in the more enclosed areas. I also use, for example, titanium white to reinforce the highlights, but I also use the oil paints just to enrich the color palette of the fur. You might also have noticed that I did not apply any dark wash in all the fur crevices, just to avoid darkening the bear's fur too much. Well, that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed the process and the explanations. I tried to be as complete as possible while maintaining the tutorial duration within reasonable limits. In the next video, we will finish our Arctic diorama Hunter and Prey, a tutorial focused mainly on epoxy resin depot procedure. Do not hesitate to drop your comments in the comment section below, and if you are a very experimented sculptor, do not hesitate to give tips and tricks and to share advices with the community. Thanks a lot, greetings from Portugal, ciao ciao.